But I reject absolutely, absolutely, you understand, the possibility that a servant would have had the courage to enter there. But I reject absolutely. But he guessed William's next question and added at once, though clearly with reluctance, including, naturally, the monks. But I reject absolutely, absolutely, you understand, the possibility that a servant would have had the courage to enter there at night. There was a kind of defiant smile in his eyes, albeit brief as a flash or a falling star. Let us say they would have been afraid. You know, sometimes orders given to the simple-minded have to be reinforced with a threat, a suggestion that something terrible will happen to the disobedient, perforce something supernatural. A monk, on the contrary. I understand. Furthermore, a monk could have other reasons for venturing into a forbidden place. I mean reasons that are reasonable, even if contrary to the rule. William noticed the abbot's uneasiness and asked a question perhaps intended to change the subject, though it produced an even greater uneasiness. Speaking of a possible murder, you said, and if that were all. What did you mean? Did I say that? Well, no one commits murder without a reason, however perverse. And I trembled to think of the perversity of the reasons that could have driven a monk to kill a brother monk. There. That is it. Nothing else? Nothing else that I can say to you. You mean that there is nothing else you have the power to say? Please, Brother William, and the abbot underlined, brother, both times. William blushed violently and remarked, Aris sacerdos in aeternum. Thank you, the abbot said. O Lord God, what a terrible mystery my imprudent superiors were broaching at that moment, the one driven by anxiety and the other by curiosity. Because, a novice approaching the mysteries of the holy priesthood of God, humble youth that I was, I, too, understood that the abbot knew something but had learned it under the seal of confession. He must have heard from someone's lips a sinful detail that could have a bearing on the tragic end of Adelmo. Perhaps for this reason he was begging Brother William to uncover a secret he himself suspected, though he was unable to reveal to anyone, and he hoped that my master, with the powers of his intellect, would cast light on what he, the abbot, had to shroud in shadows because of the sublime law of charity. Very well, William said then, may I question the monks? You may. May I move freely about the abbey? I grant you that power. Will you assign me this mission coram monachis? This very evening. I shall begin, however, today, before the monks know what you have charged me to do. Besides, I already had a great desire, not the least reason for my sojourn here, to visit your library, which is spoken of with admiration in all the abbeys of Christendom. The abbot rose, almost starting, with a very tense face. You can move freely through the whole abbey, as I have said. But not, to be sure, on the top floor of the edificium, the library. Why not? I would have explained to you before, but I thought you knew. You see, our library is not like others. I know it has more books than any other Christian library. I know that in comparison with your cases, those of Bobbio or Pomposa, of Cluny or Fleury, seem the room of a boy barely being introduced to the abacus. I know that the 6,000 codices that were the boast of Novalesa 100 or more years ago are few compared to yours, and perhaps many of those are now here. I know your abbey is the only light that Christianity can oppose to the 36 libraries of Baghdad, to the 10,000 codices of the Vizier Ibn al-Alchemy, that the number of your Bibles equals the 2,400 Qurans that are the pride of Cairo, and that the reality of your cases is luminous evidence against the proud legend of the infidels who years ago claimed, intimates as they are of the Prince of Falsehood. The library of Tripoli was rich in 6 million volumes and inhabited by 80,000 commentators and 200 scribes. You are right, heaven be praised. I know that many of the monks living in your midst come from other abbeys scattered all over the world. Some stay here a short time, to copy manuscripts to be found nowhere else and to carry them back then to their own house, not without having brought you in exchange some other unavailable manuscript that you will copy and add to your treasure, and others stay for a very long time, occasionally remaining here till death, because only here can they find the works that enlighten their research. And so you have among you Germans, Dacians, Spaniards, Frenchmen, Greeks. I know that the Emperor Frederick, many and many years ago, asked you to compile for him a book of the prophecies of Merlin and then to translate it into Arabic, to be sent as a gift to the Sultan of Egypt. I know, finally, that such a glorious abbey as Merbach in these very sad times no longer has a single scribe, that at St. Gall only a few monks are left who know how to write, that now in the cities corporations and guilds arise, made up of laymen who work for the universities, and only your abbey day after day renews, or, what am I saying? It exalts to ever greater heights the glories of your order? Monasterium sine libris, the abbot recited, pensively, est sicut civitas sine opibus, castrum sine numerus, cacina sine superlectili, mensa sine cibus, hortus sine herbis, produm sine floribus, arbor sine fui. And our order, growing up under the double command of work and prayer, was light to the whole known world, depository of knowledge, salvation of an ancient learning that threatened to disappear in fires, sacks, earthquakes, forge of new writing and increase of the ancient. Oh, as you well know, we live now in very dark times, and I blush to tell you that not many years ago the Council of Vienne had to reaffirm that every monk is under obligation to take orders. How many of our abbeys, which 200 years ago were resplendent with grandeur and sanctity, are now the refuge of the slothful? The order is still powerful, but the stink of the cities is encroaching upon our holy places. The people of God are now inclined to commerce and wars of faction. Down below in the great settlements, where the spirit of sanctity can find no lodging, not only do they speak, of laymen, nothing else could be expected, in the vulgar tongue, but they are already writing in it, though none of these volumes will ever come within our walls, fomenter of heresies as those volumes inevitably become. Because of mankind's sins the world is teetering on the brink of the abyss, permeated by the very abyss that the abyss invokes. And tomorrow, as Honorius would have it, men's bodies will be smaller than ours, just as ours are smaller than those of the ancients. Mundus senescit. If God has now given our order a mission, it is to oppose this race to the abyss, by preserving, repeating, and defending the treasure of wisdom our fathers entrusted to us. Divine Providence has ordered that the universal government, which at the beginning of the world was in the east, should gradually, as the time was nearing fulfillment, move westward to warn us that the end of the world is approaching, because the course of events has already reached the confines of the universe. But until the millennium occurs definitively, until the triumph, however brief, of the foul beast that is the Antichrist, it is up to us to defend the treasure of the Christian world, and the very word of God, as he dictated it to the prophets and to the apostles, as the fathers repeated it without changing a syllable, as the schools have tried to gloss it, even if today in the schools themselves the serpent of pride, envy, folly is nesting. In this sunset we are still torches and light, high on the horizon. And as long as these walls stand, we shall be the custodians of the divine word. Amen, William said in a devout tone. But what does this have to do with the fact that the library may not be visited? You see, Brother William, the abbot said, to achieve the immense and holy task that enriches those walls, and he nodded toward the bulk of the edificium, which could be glimpsed from the cell's windows, towering above the abbatial church itself, devout men have toiled for centuries, observing iron rules. The library was laid out on a plan which has remained obscured all over the centuries, and which none of the monks is called upon to know. Only the librarian has received the secret, from the librarian who preceded him, and he communicates it, while still alive, to the assistant librarian, so that death will not take him by surprise and rob the community of that knowledge. And the secret seals the lips of both men. Only the librarian has, in addition to that knowledge, the right to move through the labyrinth of the books. He alone knows where to find them and where to replace them. He alone is responsible for their safekeeping. The other monks work in the scriptorium and may know the list of the volumes that the library houses. But a list of titles often tells very little. Only the librarian knows, from the collocation of the volume, from its degree of inaccessibility, what secrets, what truths or falsehoods, the volume contains. Only he decides how, when, and whether to give it to the monk who requests it. Sometimes he first consults me. Because not all truths are for all ears, not all falsehoods can be recognized as such by a pious soul. And the monks, finally, are in the scriptorium to carry out a precise task, which requires them to read certain volumes and not others, and not to pursue every foolish curiosity that seizes them, whether through weakness of intellect or through pride or through diabolical prompting. So in the library there are also books containing falsehoods. Monsters exist because they are part of the divine plan, and in the horrible features of those same monsters the power of the Creator is revealed. And by divine plan, too, there exist also books by wizards, the Kabbalahs of the Jews, the fables of pagan poets, the lies of the infidels. It was the firm and holy conviction of those who founded the abbey and sustained it over the centuries that even in books of falsehood, to the eyes of the sage reader, a pale reflection of the divine wisdom can shine. And therefore the library is a vessel of these, too. But for this very reason, you understand, it cannot be visited by just anyone. And furthermore, the abbot added, as if to apologize for the weakness of this last argument, a book is a fragile creature, it suffers the wear of time, it fears rodents, the elements, clumsy hands. If for 100 years everyone had been able freely to handle our codices, the majority of them would no longer exist. So the librarian protects them not only against mankind but also against nature, and devotes his life to this war with the forces of oblivion, the enemy of truth. And so no one, except for two people, enters the top floor of the edificium. The abbot smiled. No one should. No one can. No one, even if he wished, would succeed. The library defends itself, immeasurable as the truth it houses, deceitful as the falsehood it preserves. A spiritual labyrinth, it is also a terrestrial labyrinth. You might enter and you might not emerge. And having said this, I would like you to conform to the rules of the abbey. But you have not dismissed the possibility that Adelmo fell from one of the windows of the library. And how can I study his death if I do not see the place where the story of his death may have begun? Brother William, the abbot said, in a conciliatory tone, a man who described my horse Brunellus without seeing him, and the death of Adelmo though knowing virtually nothing of it, will have no difficulty studying places to which he does not have access. William bowed. You are wise also when you are severe. It shall be as you wish. If ever I were wise, it would be because I know how to be severe, the abbot answered. One last thing, William asked. Ubertino? He is here. He is expecting you. You will find him in church. When? Always, the abbot said, and smiled. You must know that, although very learned, he is not a man to appreciate the library. He considers it a secular lure. For the most part he stays in church, meditating, praying. Is he old? William asked, hesitating. How long has it been since you saw him? Many years. He is weary. Very detached from the things of this world. He is 68. But I believe he still possesses the spirit of his youth. I will seek him out at once. Thank you. The abbot asked him whether he wanted to join the community for the midday refection after sext. William said he had only just eaten, very well, too, and he would prefer to see Ubertino at once. The abbot took his leave. He was going out of the cell when from the courtyard a heartrending cry arose, like that of someone mortally wounded, followed by other, equally horrible cries. What is that? William asked, disconcerted. Nothing, the abbot answered, smiling. At this time of year they slaughter the pigs. A job for the swineherds. This is not the blood that should concern you. He went out, and he did a disservice to his reputation as a clever man. Because the next morning. But curb your impatience, garrulous tongue of mine. For on the day of which I am telling, and before it's night, many more things happened that it would be best to narrate. Sext. In which Adza admires the door of the church, and William meets Ubertino of Casali again. The church was not majestic like others I saw later at Strasbourg, Chartres, Bamberg, and Paris. It resembled, rather, those I had already seen in Italy, with scant inclination to soar dizzyingly toward the heavens, indeed firmly set on the earth, often broader than they were high. But at the first level this one was surmounted, like a fortress, by a sequence of square battlements, and above this story another construction rose, not so much a tower as a solid, second church, capped by a pitched roof and pierced by severe windows. A robust abbatial church such as our forefathers built in Provence and Languedoc, far from the audacity and the excessive tracery characteristic of the modern style, which only in more recent times has been enriched, I believe, above the choir, with a pinnacle boldly pointed toward the roof of the heavens. Two straight and unadorned columns stood on either side of the entrance, which opened, at first sight, like a single great arch, but from the columns began two embrasures that, surmounted by other, multiple arches, led the gaze, as if into the heart of an abyss, toward the doorway itself, crowned by a great tympanum, supported on the sides by two imposts and in the center by a carved pillar, which divided the entrance into two apertures protected by oak doors reinforced in metal. At that hour of the day the weak sun was beating almost straight down on the roof and the light fell obliquely on the facade without illuminating the tympanum. So after passing the two columns, we found ourselves abruptly under the almost sylvan vault of the arches that sprang from the series of lesser columns that proportionally reinforced the embrasures. When our eyes had finally grown accustomed to the gloom, the silent speech of the carved stone, accessible as it immediately was to the gaze and the imagination of anyone, for images are the literature of the layman, dazzled my eyes and plunged me into a vision that even today my tongue can hardly describe. I saw a throne set in the sky and a figure seated on the throne. The face of the seated one was stern and impassive, the eyes wide and glaring over a terrestrial humankind that had reached the end of its story. Majestic hair and beard flowed around the face and over the chest like the waters of a river, in streams all equal, symmetrically divided in two. The crown on his head was rich in enamels and jewels, the purple imperial tunic was arranged in broad folds over the knees, woven with embroideries and laces of gold and silver thread. The left hand, resting on one knee, held a sealed book, the right was uplifted in an attitude of blessing or, I could not tell, of admonition. The face was illuminated by the tremendous beauty of a halo, containing a cross and bedecked with flowers, while around the throne and above the face of the seated one I saw an emerald rainbow glittering before the throne. Beneath the feet of the seated one, a sea of crystal flowed, and around the seated one, beside and above the throne, I saw four awful creatures, awful for me, as I looked at them, transported, but docile and dear for the seated one, whose praises they sang without cease. Or, rather, not all could be called awful, because one seemed to me handsome and kindly, the man to my left, and to the right of the seated one, who held out a book. But on the other side there was an eagle I found horrifying, its beak agape, its thick feathers arranged like a cuirass, powerful talons, great wings outstretched. And at the feet of the seated one, under the first two figures, there were the other two, a bull and a lion, each monster clutching a book between talons or hoofs, the body turned away from the throne, but the head toward the throne, as if shoulders and neck twisted in a fierce impulse, flanks tensed, the limbs those of a dying animal, maw open, serpent-like tails coiled and writhing, culminating, at the top, in tongues of flame. Both monsters were winged, both crowned by halos, Despite their formidable appearance, they were creatures not of hell, but of heaven, and if they seemed fearsome it was because they were roaring in adoration of one who was to come and who would judge the quick and the dead. Around the throne, beside the four creatures and under the feet of the seated one, as if seen through the transparent waters of the crystal sea, as if to fill the whole space of the vision, arranged according to the triangular frame of the tympanum, rising from a base of 7 plus 7, then to 3 plus 3 and then to 2 plus 2. At either side of the great throne, on 24 little thrones, there were 24 ancients, wearing white garments and crowned to gold. Some held lutes in their hands, one a vase of perfumes, and only one was playing an instrument, all the others were in ecstasy, faces turned to the seated one, whose praises they were singing, their limbs also twisted like the creatures, so that all could see the seated one, not in wild fashion, however, but with movements of ecstatic dance. As David must have danced before the ark, so that wherever their pupils were, against the law governing the stature of bodies, they converged on the same radiant spot. Oh, what a harmony of abandonment and impulse, of unnatural and yet graceful postures, in that mystical language of limbs miraculously freed from the weight of corporeal matter, marked quantity infused with new substantial form, as if the holy band were struck by an impetuous wind, breath of life, frenzy of delight, rejoicing song of praise miraculously transformed, from the sound that it was, into image. Bodies inhabited in every part by the Spirit, illuminated by revelation, faces overcome with amazement, eyes shining with enthusiasm, cheeks flushed with love, pupils dilated with joy. This one thunderstruck by a pleasurable consternation, that one pierced by a consternated pleasure, some transfigured by wonder, some rejuvenated by bliss, there they all were, singing with the expression of their faces, the drapery of their tunics, the position and tension of their limbs, singing a new song, lips parted in a smile of perennial praise. And beneath the feet of the ancients, and arched over them and over the throne and over the tetramorphic group, arranged in symmetrical bands, barely distinguishable one from another because the artist's skill had made them all so mutually proportionate, united in their variety and varied to their unity, unique in their diversity and diverse in their apt assembly, in wondrous congruency of the parts with the delightful sweetness of hues, miracle of consonance and concord of voices among themselves dissimilar, a company arrayed like the strings of the zither, consentient and conspiring continued cognition through deep and interior force suited to perform univocally in the same alternating play of the equivocal, decoration and collage of creatures beyond reduction to vicissitudes and to vicissitudes reduced, work of amorous connecting sustained by a law at once heavenly and worldly, bond and stable nexus of peace, love, virtue, regimen, power, order, origin, life, light, splendor, species, and figure, numerous and resplendent equality through the shining of the form over the proportionate parts of the material. There, all the flowers and leaves and vines and bushes and cory mbs were entwined, of all the grasses that adorn the gardens of earth and heaven, violet, cistus, thyme, lily, privet, narcissus, taro, acanthus, mallow, myrrh, and mecca balsam. But as my soul was carried away by that concert of terrestrial beauty and majestic supernatural signals, and was about to burst forth in a psalm of joy, my eye, accompanying the proportioned rhythm of the rose windows that bloomed at the ancients' feet, lighted on the interwoven figures of the central pillar, which supported the tympanum. What were they and what symbolic message did they communicate, those three crisscrossed pairs of lions rampant, like arches, each with hind paws planted on the ground, forepaws on the back of his companion, mane in serpentine curls, mouth taut in a threatening snarl, bound to the very body of the pillar by a paste, or a nest, of tendrils? To calm my spirit, as they had perhaps been meant also to tame the diabolical nature of the lion and to transform it into a symbolic allusion to higher things, on the sides of the pillar there were two human figures, unnaturally tall as the column itself and twins to two others facing them on either side from the decorated imposts, where each of the oak doors had its jamb. These figures, then, were four old men, from whose paraphernalia I recognized Peter and Paul, Jeremiah and Isaiah, also twisted as if in a dance step, their long bony hands raised, the fingers splayed like wings, and like wings were their beards and hair stirred by a prophetic wind, the folds of the very long garments stirred by the long legs giving life to waves and scrolls, opposed to the lions but of the same stuff as the lions. And as I withdrew my fascinated eye from that enigmatic polyphony of sainted limbs and infernal sinews, I saw beside the door, under the deep arches, sometimes depicted on the embrasures in the space between the slender columns that supported and adorned them, and again on the thick foliage of the capital of each column, and from there ramifying toward the sylvan vault of the multiple arches, other visions horrible to contemplate, and justified in that place only by their parabolic and allegorical power or by the moral lesson that they conveyed. I saw a voluptuous woman, naked and fleshless, gnawed by foul toads, sucked by serpents, coupled with a fat-bellied satyr whose griffin legs were covered with wiry hairs, howling its own damnation from an obscene throat. And I saw a miser, stiff in the stiffness of death on his sumptuously columned bed, now helpless prey of a cohort of demons, one of whom tore from the dying man's mouth his soul in the form of an infant, alas, never to be again born to eternal life. And I saw a proud man with a devil clinging to his shoulders and thrusting his claws into the man's eyes, while two gluttons tore each other apart in a repulsive hand-to-hand struggle, and other creatures as well, goat head and lion fur, panther's jaws, all prisoners to a forest of flames whose searing breath I could almost feel. And around them, mingled with them, above their heads and below their feet, more faces and more limbs. A man and a woman clutching each other by the hair, two asps sucking the eyes of one of the damned, a grinning man whose hooked hands parted the maw of a hydra, and all the animals of Satan's bestiary, assembled in a consistory and set as guard and crown of the throne that faced them, singing its glory in their defeat. Fauns, beings of double sex, brutes with six-fingered hands, sirens, hippocentaurs, gorgons, harpies, incubi, dragapods, minotaurs, lynxes, pards, chimeras, cynophales who darted fire from their nostrils, crocodiles, polycaudate, hairy serpents, salamanders, horned vipers, tortoises, snakes, two-headed creatures whose backs were armed with teeth, hyenas, otters, crows, hydrophora with saw-tooth horns, frogs, griffins, monkeys, dog heads, leucrota, manticores, vultures, parenders, weasels, dragons, hoopoes, owls, basilisks, hypnails, presters, spectifici, scorpions, saurians, whales, chatales, amphisbaenae, iaculae, dipsases, green lizards, pilot fish, octopi, morays, and sea turtles. The whole population of the netherworld seemed to have gathered to act as vestibule, dark forest, desperate wasteland of exclusion, at the apparition of the seated one in the tympanum, at his face promising and threatening, they, the defeated of Armageddon, facing him who will come at last to separate the quick from the dead. And stunned almost by that sight, uncertain at this point whether I was in a friendly place or in the valley of the last judgment, I was terrified and could hardly restrain my tears, and I seemed to hear, or did I really hear? That voice, and I saw those visions that had accompanied my youth as a novice, my first reading of the sacred books, and my nights of meditation in the choir of milk, and in the delirium of my weak and weakened senses I heard a voice mighty as a trumpet that said, "Write in a book what you now see. And this is what I am doing. And I saw 7 golden candlesticks, and in the midst of the candlesticks one like unto the Son of Man, his breast girt with a golden girdle, his head and hair white as purest wool, his eyes as a flame of fire, his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace, his voice as the sound of many waters, and he had in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a two-edged sword. And I saw a door open in heaven, and he who was seated appeared to me like a jasper and a sardonyx, and there was a rainbow round about the throne, and out of the throne proceeded thunder and lightning. And the seated one took in his hands a sharp sickle and cried, "Thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." And he that sat on the cloud thrust his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. It was at this point that I realized the vision was speaking precisely of what was happening in the abbey, of what we had learned from the abbot's reticent lips. And how many times in the following days did I return to contemplate the doorway, convinced I was experiencing the very events that it narrated. And I knew we had made our way up there in order to witness a great and celestial massacre. I trembled, as if I were drenched by the icy winter rain. And I heard yet another voice, but this time it came from behind me and was a different voice, because it came from the earth and not from the blinding core of my vision. And indeed it shattered the vision, because William, I became aware again of his presence, also lost until then in contemplation, turned as I did. The creature behind us was apparently a monk, though his torn and dirty habit made him look like a vagabond, and his face bore a resemblance to those of the monsters I had just seen on the capitals. Unlike many of my brothers, I have never in my whole life been visited by the devil, but I believe that if he were to appear to me one day, prevented by divine decree from concealing completely his nature even though he chose to resemble a man, he would have the very features our interlocutor presented to me at this moment. His head was hairless, not shaved in penance but as the result of the past action of some viscid eczema. The brow was so low that if he had had hair on his head it would have mingled with his eyebrows, which were thick and shaggy. The eyes were round, with tiny mobile pupils, and whether the gaze was innocent or malign I could not tell. Perhaps it was both, in different moods, in flashes. The nose could not be called a nose, for it was only a bone that began between the eyes, but as it rose from the face it immediately sank again, transforming itself only into 2 dark holes, broad nostrils thick with hair. The mouth, joined to the nose by a scar, was wide and ill-made, stretching more to the right than to the left, and between the upper lip, non-existent, and the lower, prominent and fleshy, there protruded, in an irregular pattern, black teeth sharp as a dog's. The man smiled, or at least so I believed, and, holding up one finger as if in admonition, he said, "Penitenziagite. Watch out for the Draco who cometh in futurum to gnaw your anima. Death is super nos. Pray the Santo Pater come to liberar nos amalo and all our sin." Ha ha, you like this negromanzia de Domini Nostri Jesu Christi. Et anco joys mes doles e plazer mes dolors. Cave el diabolo. Semper lying in wait for me in some angulum to snap at my heels. But Salvator is not stupidus. Bonum monasterium, and qui refectorium and pray to Dominum nostrum. And the resto is not worth merda. Amen. No? As this story continues, I shall have to speak again, and at length, of this creature and record his speech. I confess I find it very difficult to do so because I could not say now, as I could never understand then, what language he spoke. It was not Latin, in which the lettered men of the monastery expressed themselves, it was not the vulgar tongue of those parts, or any other I had ever heard. I believe I have given a faint idea of his manner of speech, reporting just now, as I remember them, the first words of his I heard. When I learned later about his adventurous life and about the various places where he had lived, putting down roots in none of them, I realized Salvatore spoke all languages and no language. Or, rather, he had invented for himself a language which used the sinews of the languages to which he had been exposed, and once I thought that his was, not the Adamic language that a happy mankind had spoken, all united by a single tongue from the origin of the world to the Tower of Babel, or one of the languages that arose after the dire event of their division, but precisely the babelish language of the first day after the divine chastisement, the language of primeval confusion. Nor, for that matter, could I call Salvatore's speech a language, because in every human language there are rules and every term signifies ad placidum a thing, according to a law that does not change, for man cannot call the dog once dog and once cat, or utter sounds to which a consensus of people has not assigned a definite meaning, as would happen if someone said the word blittery, and yet, one way or another, I did understand what Salvatore meant, and so did the others. Proof that he spoke not one, but all languages, none correctly, taking words sometimes from one and sometimes from another. I also noticed afterward that he might refer to something first in Latin and later in Provençal, and I realized that he was not so much inventing his own sentences as using the disiecta membra of other sentences, heard some time in the past, according to the present situation and the things he wanted to say, as if he could speak of a food, for instance, only with the words of the people among whom he had eaten that food, and express his joy only with sentences that he had heard uttered by joyful people the day when he had similarly experienced joy. His speech was somehow like his face, put together with pieces from other people's faces, or like some precious reliquaries I have seen. Si licet magnus componere parva, if I may link diabolical things with the divine, fabricated from the shards of other holy objects. At that moment, when I met him for the first time, Salvatore seemed to me, because of both his face and his way of speaking, a creature not unlike the hairy and hoofed hybrids I had just seen under the portal. Later I realized that the man was probably good-hearted and humorous. Later still. But we must not get ahead of our story. Particularly since, the moment he had spoken, my master questioned him with great curiosity. "Why did you say penitenziagite?" he asked. "Domini frate magnificentissimo," Salvatore answered, with a kind of bow, "Jesus venerus est and les hommes must do penitentia." "No?" William gave him a hard look. "Did you come here from a convent of Minorites?" "Non comprends. I am asking if you have lived among the friars of St. Francis. I ask if you have known the so-called apostles." Salvatore blanched, or, rather, his tanned and savage face turned gray. He made a deep bow, muttered through half-closed lips a vade retro, devoutly blessed himself, and fled, looking back at us every now and then. "What did you ask him?" I said to William. He was thoughtful for a moment. "It is of no matter, I will tell you later. Let us go inside now. I want to find Ubertino." It was just after the 6th hour. The pale sun entered from the west, and therefore through only a few, narrow windows, into the interior of the church. A fine strip of light still touched the main altar, whose frontal seemed to glow with a golden radiance. The side naves were immersed in gloom. Near the last chapel before the altar, in the left nave, stood a slender column on which a stone Virgin was set, carved in the modern fashion, with an ineffable smile and prominent abdomen, wearing a pretty dress with a small bodice, the child on her arm. At the foot of the Virgin, in prayer, almost prostrate, there was a man in the habit of the Cluniac order. We approached. The man, hearing the sound of our footsteps, raised his head. He was old, bald, with a glabrous face, large pale blue eyes, a thin red mouth, white complexion, a bony skull to which the skin clung like that of a mummy preserved in milk. The hands were white, with long tapering fingers. He resembled a maiden withered by premature death. He cast on us a gaze at first bewildered, as if we had disturbed him during an ecstatic vision, then his face brightened with joy. "William," he exclaimed. "My dearest brother." He rose with some effort and came toward my master, embraced him, and kissed him on the mouth. "William," he repeated, and his eyes became moist with tears. "How long it has been. But I recognize you still. Such a long time, so many things have happened. So many trials sent by the Lord." He wept. William returned his embrace, clearly moved. We were in the presence of Ubertino of Casale. I had already heard much talk about him, even before I came to Italy, and more still as I frequented the Franciscans of the imperial court. Someone had told me that the greatest poet of those days, Dante Alighieri of Florence, dead only a few years, had composed a poem, which I could not read, since it was written in vulgar Tuscan, of which many verses were nothing but a paraphrase of passages written by Ubertino in his Arbor Vitae Crucifixae. Nor was this the famous man's only claim to merit. But to permit my reader better to understand the importance of this meeting, I must try to reconstruct the events of those years, as I understood them both during my brief stay to central Italy and from listening to the many conversations William had had with abbots and monks in the course of our journey. I will try to tell what I understood of these matters, even if I am not sure I can explain them properly. My masters at Melk had often told me that it is very difficult for a northerner to form any clear idea of the religious and political vicissitudes of Italy. The peninsula, where the power of the clergy was more evident than in any other country, and where more than in any other country the clergy made a display of power and wealth, for at least 2 centuries had generated movements of men bent on a poorer life, in protest against the corrupt priests, from whom they even refused the sacraments. They gathered in independent communities, hated equally by the feudal lords, the empire, and the city magistrates. Finally Saint Francis had appeared, spreading a love of poverty that did not contradict the precepts of the Church, and after his efforts the Church had accepted the summons to severe behavior of those older movements and had purified them of the elements of disruption that lurked in them. There should have followed a period of meekness and holiness, but as the Franciscan order grew and attracted the finest men, it became too powerful, too bound to earthly matters, and many Franciscans wanted to restore it to its early purity. A very difficult matter for an order that at the time when I was at the abbey already numbered more than 30,000 members scattered throughout the whole world. But so it was, and many of those monks of St. Francis were opposed to the rule that the order had established, and they said the order had by now assumed the character of those ecclesiastical institutions it had come into the world to reform. And this, they said, had already happened in the days when St. Francis was alive, and his words and his aims had been betrayed. Many of them rediscovered then a book written at the beginning of the 12th century of our era, by a Cistercian monk named Joachim, to whom the spirit of prophecy was attributed. He had in fact foreseen the advent of a new age, in which the Spirit of Christ, long corrupted through the actions of his false apostles, would again be achieved on earth. And he had announced certain future events in a way that made it seem clear to all that, unawares, he was speaking of the Franciscan order. And therefore many Franciscans had greatly rejoiced, even excessively, it seems, because then, around the middle of the century, the doctors of the Sorbonne condemned the teachings of that abbot Joachim. Apparently they did so because the Franciscans, and the Dominicans, were becoming too powerful, too learned, at the University of Paris, and those Sorbonne doctors wanted to eliminate them as heretics. But this scheme was not carried out, happily for the Church, which then allowed the dissemination of the works of Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure of Bagnoregio, certainly not heretics. Whence it is clear that in Paris, too, there was a confusion of ideas or someone who wished to confuse them for his own purposes. And this is the evil that heresy inflicts on the Christian people, obfuscating ideas and inciting all to become inquisitors to their personal benefit. For what I saw at the abbey then, and will now recount, caused me to think that often inquisitors create heretics. And not only in the sense that they imagine heretics where these do not exist, but also that inquisitors repress the heretical putrefaction so vehemently that many are driven to share in it, in their hatred for the judges. Truly, a circle conceived by the devil. God preserve us. But I was speaking of the heresy, if such it was, of the Joachimites. And in Tuscany there was a Franciscan, Gerard of Borgo San Donino, who repeated the predictions of Joachim and made a deep impression on the Minorites. Thus there arose among them a band of supporters of the old rule, against the reorganization of the order attempted by the great Bonaventure, who had become general of the order. In the final 30 years of the last century, the Council of Lyons rescued the Franciscan order from its enemies, who wanted to abolish it, and allowed it ownership of all property in its use, already the law for older orders. But some monks in the marches rebelled, because they believed that the spirit of the rule had been forever betrayed, since Franciscans must own nothing, personally or as a convent or as an order. These rebels were put in prison for life. It does not seem to me that they were preaching things contrary to the gospel, but when the cession of earthly things is in question, it is difficult for men to reason justly. I was told that years later, the new general of the order, Raymond Gaufredi, found these prisoners in Ancona and, on freeing them, said, "Would God that all of us in the whole order were stained by such a sin." A sign that what the heretics say is not true, and there are still men of great virtue living in the Church. Among these freed prisoners there was one, Angelus Clarinus, who then met a monk from Provence, Pierre Oliu, who preached the prophecies of Joachim, and then he met Ubertino of Casali, and in this way the movement of the spirituals originated. In those years, a most holy hermit rose to the papal throne, Peter of Morone, who reigned as Celestine V, and he was welcomed with relief by the spirituals. A saint will appear, it had been said, and he will follow the teachings of Christ, he will live an angelic life. Tremble, ye corrupt priests. Perhaps Celestine's life was too angelic, or the prelates around him were too corrupt, or he could not bear the strain of the interminable conflict with the emperor and with the other kings of Europe. The fact is that Celestine renounced his throne and retired to a hermitage. But in the brief period of his reign, less than a year, the hopes of the spirituals were all fulfilled. They went to Celestine, who founded with them the community known as that of the Freres et Paupers Heremiti Domini Celestini. On the other hand, while the Pope was to act as mediator among the most powerful cardinals of Rome, there were some, like a Colonna and an Orsini, who secretly supported the new poverty movement, a truly curious choice for powerful men who lived in vast wealth and luxury. And I have never understood whether they simply exploited the spirituals for their own political ends or whether in some way they felt they justified their carnal life by supporting the spiritual trend. Perhaps both things were true, to judge by the little I can understand of Italian affairs. But to give an example, Ubertino had been taken on as chaplain by Cardinal Orsini when, having become the most respected among the spirituals, he risked being accused as a heretic. And the cardinal himself had protected Ubertino in Avignon. As happens, however, in such cases, on the one hand Angelus and Ubertino preached according to doctrine, on the other, great masses of simple people accepted this preaching of theirs and spread through the country, beyond all control. So Italy was invaded by these fraticelli or friars of the poor life, whom many considered dangerous. At this point it was difficult to distinguish the spiritual masters, who maintained contact with the ecclesiastical authorities, from their simpler followers, who now lived outside the order, begging for alms and existing from day to day by the labor of their hands, holding no property of any kind. And these the populace now called fraticelli, not unlike the French Bigards, who drew their inspiration from Pierre Oliu. Celestine V was succeeded by Boniface VIII, and this pope promptly demonstrated scant indulgence for spirituals and fraticelli in general. In the last years of the dying century he signed a bull, Firma Cautela, in which with one stroke he condemned Bizacci, vagabond mendicants who roamed about at the far edge of the Franciscan order, and the spirituals themselves, who had left the life of the order and retired to a hermitage. After the death of Boniface VIII, the spirituals tried to obtain from certain of his successors, among them Clement V, permission to leave the order peaceably. I believe they would have succeeded, but the advent of John XXII robbed them of all hope. When he was elected in 1316, he wrote to the king of Sicily telling him to expel those monks from his lands, where many had taken refuge, and John had Angelus Clarinus and the spirituals of Provence put in chains. All cannot have proceeded smoothly, and many in the Curia resisted. The fact is that Ubertino and Clarinus managed to obtain permission to leave the order, and the former was received by the Benedictines, the latter by the Celestinians. But for those who continued to lead their free life John was merciless, and he had them persecuted by the Inquisition, and many were burned at the stake. He realized, however, that to destroy the weed of the fraticelli, who threatened the very foundation of the Church's authority, he would need to condemn the notions on which their faith was based. They claimed that Christ and the apostles had owned no property, individually or in common, and the Pope condemned this idea as heretical. An amazing position, because there is no evident reason why a Pope should consider perverse the notion that Christ was poor. But only a year before, a general chapter of the Franciscans in Perugia had sustained this opinion, and in condemning the one, the Pope was condemning also the other. As have I already said, the chapter was a great reverse in his struggle against the emperor. This is the fact of the matter. So after that, many fraticelli, who knew nothing of empire or of Perugia, were burned to death. These thoughts were in my mind as I gazed on the legendary figure of Ubertino. My master introduced me, and the old man stroked my cheek with a warm, almost burning hand. At the touch of his hand I understood many of the things I had heard about that holy man and others I had read in the pages of his Arbor Vitae Crucifixae. I understood the mystic fire that had consumed him from his youth when, though studying in Paris, he had withdrawn from theological speculation and had imagined himself transformed into the penitent Magdalene, and then his intense association with Saint Angela of Foligno, who had initiated him into the riches of the mystic life and the adoration of the cross, and why his superiors, one day, alarmed by the ardor of his preaching, had sent him in retreat to Laverna. I studied that face, its features sweet as those of the sainted woman with whom he had fraternally exchanged profound spiritual thoughts. I sensed he must have been able to assume a far harsher expression when, in 1311, the Council of Vienne, with the Decretal Exivi de Paradiso, had deposed Franciscan superiors hostile to the spirituals, but had charged the latter to live in peace within the order, and this champion of renunciation had not accepted that shrewd compromise and had fought for the institution of a separate order, based on principles of maximum strictness. This great warrior then lost his battle, for in those years John XXII was advocating a crusade against the followers of Pierre Oliu, among whom Ubertino himself was numbered, and he condemned the monks of Narbonne and Béziers. But Ubertino had not hesitated to defend his friend's memory against the Pope, and, outdone by his sanctity, John had not dared condemn him, though he then condemned the others. On that occasion, indeed, he offered Ubertino a way of saving himself, first advising him and then commanding him to enter the Cluniac order. Ubertino, apparently so disarmed and fragile, must have been equally skillful in gaining protectors and allies in the papal courts, and, in fact, he agreed to enter the monastery of Gemblach in Flanders, but I believe he never even went there, and he remained in Avignon, under the banner of Cardinal Orsini, to defend the Franciscans' cause. Only in recent times, and the rumors I had heard were vague, his star at court had waned, he had had to leave Avignon, and the Pope had this indomitable man pursued as a heretic who per mundum discurrit vagabundus. Then, it was said, all trace of him was lost. That afternoon I had learned, from the dialogue between William and the abbot, that he was hidden here in this abbey. And now I saw him before me. William, he was saying, they were on the point of killing me, you know. I had to flee in the dead of night. Who wanted to kill you? John? No, John has never been fond of me, but he has never ceased to respect me. After all, he was the one who offered me a way of avoiding a trial 10 years ago, commanding me to enter the Benedictines, and so silencing my enemies. They muttered for a long time. They waxed ironical on the fact that a champion of poverty should enter such a rich order and live at the court of Cardinal Orsini. William, you know my contempt for the things of this earth. But it was the way to remain in Avignon and defend my brothers. The Pope is afraid of Orsini. He would never have harmed a hair of my head. As recently as 3 years ago he sent me as his envoy to the King of Aragon. Then who wished you ill? All of them. The Curia. They tried to assassinate me twice. They tried to silence me. You know what happened 5 years ago. The Bigards of Narbonne had been condemned 2 years before, and Berengar Delony, though he was one of the judges, had appealed to the Pope. Those were difficult moments. John had already issued 2 bulls against the spirituals, and even Michael of Cesena had given up. By the way, when does he arrive? He will be here in 2 days' time. Michael. I have not seen him for so long. Now he has come around. He understands what we wanted. The Perugia chapter asserted that we were right. But then, still in 1318, he gave in to the Pope and turned over to him 5 spirituals of Provence who were resisting submission. Burned, William. Oh, it is horrible. He hid his face in his hands. But what exactly happened after Toloni's appeal? William asked. John had to reopen the debate, you understand. He has to do it, because in the Curia, too, there were men seized with doubt, even the Franciscans in the Curia, Pharisees, whited sepulchres, ready to sell themselves for a prebend, but they were seized with doubt. It was then that John asked me to draw up a memorial on poverty. It was a fine work, William, may God forgive my pride. I have read it. Michael showed it to me. There were the hesitant, even among our own men, the provincial of Aquitaine, the Cardinal of San Vitale, the Bishop of Caffa. An idiot, William said. Rest in peace. He was gathered to God 2 years ago. God was not so compassionate. That was a false report that arrived from Constantinople. He is still in our midst, and I am told he will be a member of the legation. God protect us. But he is favorable to the chapter of Perugia, Ubertino said. Exactly. He belongs to that race of men who are always their adversaries' best champions. To tell the truth, Ubertino said, even then he was no great help to the cause. And it all came to nothing, but at least the idea was not declared heretical, and this was important. And so the others have never forgiven me. They have tried to harm me in every way. They have said that I was at Sachsenhausen 3 years ago, when Louis proclaimed John a heretic. And yet they all knew I was in Avignon that July with Orsini. They found that parts of the Emperor's declaration reflected my ideas. What madness! Not all that mad, William said. I had given him the ideas, taking them from your declaration of Avignon, and from some pages of Oliu. You? Ubertino exclaimed, between amazement and joy. But then you agree with me. William seemed embarrassed. They were the right ideas for the Emperor at that moment, he said evasively. Ubertino looked at him suspiciously. Ah, but you don't really believe them, do you? Tell me, William said, tell me how you saved yourself from those dogs. Ah, dogs indeed, William. Rabid dogs. I found myself even in conflict with Bonagracia, you know? But Bonagracia is on our side. Now he is, after I spoke at length with him. Then he was convinced, and he protested against the ad conditorum canonum. And the Pope imprisoned him for a year. I have heard he is now close to a friend of mine in the Curia, William of Ockham. I knew him only slightly. I don't like him. A man without fervor, all head, no heart. But the head is beautiful. Perhaps, and it will take him to hell. Then I will see him again down there, and we will argue logic. Hush, William, Ubertino said, smiling with deep affection, you are better than your philosophers. If only you had wanted. What? When we saw each other the last time in Umbria, remember? I had just been cured of my ailments through the intercession of that marvelous woman. Claire of Montefalco, he murmured, his face radiant. Claire. When female nature, naturally so perverse, becomes sublime through holiness, then it can be the noblest vehicle of grace. You know how my life has been inspired by the purest chastity, William. He grasped my master's arm, convulsively. You know with what fierce, yes, that's the word, with what fierce thirst for penance I have tried to mortify in myself the throbbing of the flesh, and make myself wholly transparent to the love of Jesus crucified. And yet, 3 women in my life have been 3 celestial messengers for me. Angela of Foligno, Margaret of Città di Castello, who revealed the end of my book to me when I had written only a third of it, and finally Claire of Montefalco. It was a reward from heaven that I should investigate her miracles and proclaim her sainthood to the crowds, before Holy Mother Church moved. And you were there, William, and you could have helped me in that holy endeavor, and you would not. But the holy endeavor that you invited me to share was sending Bentivenga, Giacomo, and Giovannuccio to the stake, William said softly. They were besmirching her memory with their perversions. And you were an inquisitor. And that was precisely why I asked to be relieved of that position. I did not like the business. Nor did I like, I shall be frank, the way you induced Bentivenga to confess his errors. You pretended you wished to enter his sect, if sect it was. You stole his secrets from him, and you had him arrested. But that is the way to proceed against the enemies of Christ. They were heretics, they were pseudo-apostles, they reeked of the sulfur of Fra Dolcino. They were Claire's friends. No, William, you must not cast even the hint of a shadow on Claire's memory. But they were associated with her. They were Minorites, they called themselves spirituals, and instead they were monks of the community. But you know it emerged clearly at the trial that Bentivenga of Gubbio proclaimed himself an apostle, and then he and Giovannuccio of Bevagna seduced nuns, telling them hell does not exist, that carnal desires can be satisfied without offending God, that the body of Christ, Lord, forgive me, can be received after a man has lain with a nun, that the Magdalene found more favor in the Lord's sight than the Virgin Agnes, that what the vulgar call the devil is God himself, because the devil is knowledge and God is by definition knowledge. And it was the blessed Claire, after hearing this talk, who had the vision in which God himself told her they were wicked followers of the Spiritus Libertatis. They were Minorites whose minds were aflame with the same visions as Claire's, and often the step between ecstatic vision and sinful frenzy is very brief, William said. Ubertino wrung his hands and his eyes were again veiled with tears. Don't say that, William. How can you confound the moment of ecstatic love, which burns the viscera with the perfume of incense, and the disorder of the senses, which reeks of sulfur? Bentivenga urged others to touch a body's naked limbs. He declared this was the only way to freedom from the dominion of the senses. Homo nudus cum nudi acebat, naked they lay together, man and woman. Et non commissabantur ad invisum, but there was no conjunction. Lies. They were seeking pleasure, and they found it. If carnal stimulus was felt, they did not consider it a sin if, to satisfy it, man and woman lay together, and the one touched and kissed the other in every part, and naked belly was joined to naked belly. I confess that the way Ubertino stigmatized the vice of others did not inspire virtuous thoughts in me. My master must have realized I was agitated, and he interrupted the holy man. Yours is an ardent spirit, Ubertino, both in love of God and in hatred of evil. What I meant is that there is little difference between the ardor of the seraphim and the ardor of Lucifer, because they are always born from an extreme igniting of the will. Oh, there is a difference, and I know it. Ubertino said, inspired. You mean that between desiring good and desiring evil there is a brief step, because it is always a matter of directing the will. This is true. But the difference lies in the object, and the object is clearly recognizable. God on this side, the devil on that. And I fear I no longer know how to distinguish, Ubertino. Wasn't it your Angela of Foligno who told of that day when her spirit was transported and she found herself in the sepulchre of Christ? Didn't she tell how first she kissed his breast and saw him lying with his eyes closed, then she kissed his mouth, and there rose from those lips an ineffable sweetness, and after a brief pause she lay her cheek against the cheek of Christ and Christ put his hand to her cheek and pressed her to him and, as she said, her happiness became sublime? What does this have to do with the urge of the senses? Ubertino asked. It was a mystical experience, and the body was our Lord's. Perhaps I am accustomed to Oxford, William said, where even mystical experience was of another sort. All in the head. Ubertino smiled. Or in the eyes. God perceived as light, in the rays of the sun, the images of mirrors, the diffusion of colors over the parts of ordered matter, in the reflections of daylight on wet leaves. Isn't this love closer to Francis's when he praises God in his creatures, flowers, grass, water, air? I don't believe this type of love can produce any snare. Whereas I'm suspicious of a love that transmutes into a colloquy with the Almighty the shudders felt in fleshly contacts. You blaspheme, William. It is not the same thing. There is an immense abyss between the high ecstasy of the heart-loving Christ crucified and the base, corrupt ecstasy of the pseudo-apostles of Montefalco. They were not pseudo-apostles, they were brothers of the free spirit, you said as much yourself. What difference is there? You haven't heard everything about that trial, I myself never dared record certain confessions, for fear of casting, if only for a moment, the shadow of the devil on the atmosphere of sanctity Claire had created in that place. But I learned certain things, William. They gathered at night in a cellar, they took a newborn boy, they threw him from one to another until he died, of blows, or other causes. And he who caught him alive for the last time, and held him as he died, became the leader of the sect. And the child's body was torn to pieces and mixed with flour, to make blasphemous hosts. Ubertino, William said firmly, these things were said, many centuries ago, by the Armenian bishops, about the sect of the Paulicians. And about the Bogomils. What does that matter? The devil is stubborn, he follows a pattern in his snares and his seductions, he repeats his rituals at a distance of millennia, he is always the same, this is precisely why he is recognized as the enemy. I swear to you. They lighted canes on Easter night and took maidens into the cellar. Then they extinguished the candles and threw themselves on the maidens, even if they were bound to them by ties of blood. And if from this conjunction a baby was born, the infernal rite was resumed, all around a little jar of wine, which they called the keg, and they became drunk and would cut the baby to pieces, and pour its blood into the goblet, and they threw babies on the fire, still alive, and they mixed the baby's ashes in his blood and drank. But Michael Pacellus wrote this in his book on the workings of devils 300 years ago. Who told you these things? They did. Bentavenga and the others, and under torture. There is only one thing that arouses animals more than pleasure, and that is pain. Under torture you are as if under the dominion of those grasses that produce visions. Everything you have heard told, everything you have read returns to your mind, as if you were being transported, not toward heaven, but toward hell. Under torture you say not only what the Inquisitor wants, but also what you imagine might please him, because a bond, this, truly, diabolical, is established between you and him. These things I know, Ubertino. I also have belonged to those groups of men who believe they can produce the truth with white-hot iron. Well, let me tell you, the white heat of truth comes from another flame. Under torture Bentavenga may have told the most absurd lies, because it was no longer himself speaking, but his lust, the devils of his soul. Lust? Yes, there is a lust for pain, as there is a lust for adoration, and even a lust for humility. If it took so little to make the rebellious angels direct their ardor away from worship and humility toward pride and revolt, what can we expect of a human being? There, now you know. This was the thought that struck me in the course of my inquisitions. And this is why I gave up that activity. I lacked the courage to investigate the weaknesses of the wicked, because I discovered they are the same as the weaknesses of the saintly. Ubertino had listened to William's last words as if not understanding them. From the old man's expression, as it became filled with affectionate commiseration, I realized he considered William prey to culpable sentiments, which he forgave because he loved my master greatly. Ubertino interrupted him and said in a very bitter voice, "It does not matter. If that was how you felt, you were right to stop. Temptations must be fought. Still, I lacked your support. With it, we could have routed that band. And instead, you know what happened. I myself was accused of being weak toward them, and I was suspected of heresy. You were weak also, in fighting evil. Evil, William. Will this condemnation never cease, this shadow, this mire that prevents us from arriving at the holy source?" He moved still closer to William, as if he were afraid someone might overhear. "Here, too, even among these walls consecrated to prayer, you know?" "I know. The abbot has spoken to me, in fact, he asked me to help him shed light on it. Then observe, investigate, look with a lynx's eye in both directions, lust and pride." Lust? Yes, lust. There was something, feminine, and therefore diabolical, about that young man who was dead. He had the eyes of a maiden seeking commerce with an incubus. But I said, pride, also, the pride of the intellect, in this monastery consecrated to the pride of the word, to the illusion of wisdom. If you know something, help me. I know nothing. There is nothing that I know. But the heart senses certain things. Let your heart speak, question faces, do not listen to tongues. But come, why must we talk of these sad things and frighten this young friend of ours? He looked at me with his pale blue eyes, grazing my cheek with his long white fingers, and I instinctively almost withdrew. I controlled myself and was right to do so, because I would have offended him, and his intention was pure. "Tell me of yourself instead," he said, turning again to William. "What have you done since then?" "It has been 18 years. I went back to my country. I resumed studying at Oxford. I studied nature. Nature is good because she is the daughter of God," Ubertino said. "And God must be good, since he generated nature," William said with a smile. "I studied, I met some very wise friends. Then I came to know Marsilius. I was attracted by his ideas about empire, the people, about a new law for the kingdoms of the earth, and so I ended up in that group of our brothers who are advising the emperor. But you know these things. I wrote you. I rejoiced at Bobbio when they told me you were here. We believed you were lost. But now that you are with us you can be of great help in a few days, when Michael also arrives. It will be a harsh conflict with Berengar Toloni. I really believe we will have some amusement. Ubertino looked at him with a tentative smile. I can never tell when you Englishmen are speaking seriously. There is nothing amusing about such a serious question. At stake is the survival of the order, which is your order, and in my heart it is mine, too. But I shall implore Michael not to go to Avignon. John wants him, seeks him, invites him too insistently. Don't trust that old Frenchman. O Lord, into what hands has thy church fallen? He turned his head toward the altar. Transformed into harlot, weakened by luxury, she roils in lust like a snake in heat. From the naked purity of the stable of Bethlehem, made of wood as the lignum vitae of the cross was wood, to the bacchanalia of gold and stone. Look, look here. You have seen the doorway. There is no escaping the pride of images. The days of the Antichrist are finally at hand, and I am afraid, William. He looked around, staring wide-eyed among the dark naves, as if the Antichrist were going to appear any moment, and I actually expected to glimpse him. His lieutenants are already here, dispatched as Christ dispatched the apostles into the world. They are trampling on the city of God, seducing through deceit, hypocrisy, violence. It will be then that God will have to send his servants, Elijah and Enoch, whom he maintained alive in the earthly paradise so that one day they may confound the Antichrist, and they will come to prophesy clad in sackcloth, and they will preach penance by word and by example. They have already come, Ubertino, William said, indicating his Franciscan habit. But they have not yet triumphed. This is the moment when the Antichrist, filled with rage, will command the killing of Enoch and Elijah and the exposure of their bodies for all to see and thus be afraid of imitating them. Just as they wanted to kill me. At that moment, terrified, I thought Ubertino was in the power of a kind of holy frenzy, and I feared for his reason. Now, with the distance of time, knowing what I know, namely, that 2 years later he would be mysteriously killed in a German city by a murderer never discovered, I am all the more terrified, because obviously that evening Ubertino was prophesying. The abbot Joachim spoke the truth, you know. We have reached the 6th era of human history, when 2 antichrists will appear, the mystic Antichrist and the Antichrist proper. This is happening now, in the 6th era, after Francis appeared to receive in his own flesh the 5 wounds of Jesus crucified. Boniface was the mystic Antichrist, and the abdication of Celestine was not valid. Boniface was the beast that rises up from the sea whose 7 heads represent the offenses to the deadly sins and whose 10 horns the offenses